All right, so I was just ending my last lecture talking about slavery in Rome and aspects of it, and then also how the compare and contrast of that legacy on American slavery worth contemplating. Okay, so also the role of women. So essentially, around um, the third century, mid third century CE, women no longer had their uh, things passed from the father to the husband. In other words, a husband and her guardian always basically had legal control over her. Now, she's still, yes, under the control of the male, but she didn't have um, the circumstance apparently created more freedom for them than they had before. So we're doing a compare and contrast. We're not saying that they were necessarily free, but having that, they were able to own property, also something that not women in every society has been able to have. We have written accounts of them making investments, becoming very educated, and a certain amount of political power. And you see that, they talked about in the case of Livia um, and the influence that she had, and also Plotina, or Hadrian even mentioned one of the Roman Caesars. She often made requests of me, and I never once refused her. And talking about how she may have even helped him um, uh, uh, get influence to taking power. So, um, yes, it was limited, but they weren't cloistered up, at least for elite women, in the way that they might have been before or in other societies. And so again, we're not talking about women being liberated. We're not talking about a feminist movement per se, but we're talking about something different, especially for elite women. And that's also something that we need to kind of emphasize, right? That we're talking about a minority of women having changed conditions within the empire. No doubt, women who were household slaves were often used sexually their whole entire lives by their masters, and that likely wouldn't have changed much, let's say, in that regard, and sometimes maybe even men. But in any case, something. And so, those are the two women that were just mentioned there as examples. And then we're just going to cover over other aspects of culture in this age is literature and the empire. And Livy and Tacitus, these names that history writings, like I was mentioning about how the Germans were affected by Tacitus, Greco-Roman education, and in particular here now we're talking about strictly Roman writers, and their telling of history and how they did it essentially becomes a part of the Western canon. And you'll see if you continue your life to be an educated person and to study philosophy and other aspects of history, and like whatever you're doing, you're going to come across so many of the names that have been mentioned here. And you're going to see the influence that they're going to have. So that's all I want to say on that part. Here's an artistic depiction of aristocratic women, and I guess it's fair to say that when people are well-to-do and well taken care of, they kind of have the same look, right? Happy, clean, and pretty. Anyways, okay, so moving on to here. Literature in the empire, imperial poetry. Ovid was huge, and he still is to a certain extent. Ironically, it's funny because if you read the book, it talks about how he wrote these erotic love poems, and he did this kind of scandalous, on-the-edge living, that rock style lifestyle of a poet. And he gets himself in trouble, and eventually he becomes exiled to a small backwards town in the Black Sea to live in misery and isolation. When I got married at 20, the old age of 20, which I'm no longer married, but when I was married, there was this really depressed intellectual guy that came into the cafe that I used to work at, and he was pretty self-absorbed. Interesting character. But for our wedding gift, he gave us a book of Ovid's poetry. Not the erotic love poetry, which would have, I think, been suitable for a married couple, but he gave us the book of his depressed being in exile poems about being sad about being in exile, and talked about how it reminded him of himself. And that was kind of the way he rolled. But it's funny because at 20, I was bought my first Ovid book by this would-be self-absorbed, sad, intellectual coffee shop guy from New York. Um, and and then Horace, if you saw the Dead Poets Society with the late great Robin Williams, there's that scene about carpe diem, seizing the day, that was so inspiring in the film, where he was quoting the Latin coming from Horace as well. So I just kind of want to show you again how, while these names are probably not something that pops up all the time, in popular culture we do get exposed to them still, even if maybe we're not aware of it or seeing it indirectly. And then Virgil's Aeneid is also very important, kind of on the same level as Homer for the Romans. Okay, so again, I just wanted to kind of show you those. In terms of science in the Roman Empire, well, they're again taking on the Greek world. I mean, you had Claudius Ptolemy's geography. He was wrong, the Ptolemaic model, on much of things, but he's going to be the standard. And then Galen, more tragically, I mean, he's a very interesting character, and I think we shouldn't be too hard on them. All of these thinkers of the times were working with limited sets of information, but the idea of bleeding people as a way to heal them, as mentioned in the book, took place up until like the 18th century. George Washington, our president, could have probably lived a little longer, but many of you may know this, that his doctor was bleeding him like crazy on his last days on his bed, and he was convinced that bleeding, having his arm cut and blood pouring out, has made him better in the past. And that really kind of comes from that residual of that Galen's concept of doing that. And, so that's an unfortunate legacy, but fundamental for a long time too. So okay, so we'll go from there, and then I'm going to end this lecture here, and then I'm going to shift gears and really talk about Judaism and really talk about Christianity. And I have some PowerPoints for myself that I've made that are going to go a little off just even some of the things that were discussed in the text, and expand a little further. But in Rome, the religious life, polytheism, and the empire. Now, I talked about how the so-called barbarians were pagans and that they'd be incorporated into Rome. Well, many of the elites began to take on going from their pagan Germanic gods and the Celtic gods, and incorporated the Roman gods, official state Roman gods. And there would never be seen a contradiction in this. It was very common to have what they call synchronism. And synchronism is when you blend several different religious elements together. This is officially taboo and unheard of for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in fact, one could argue that Protestantism and what we see even like with ISIS or the religious ideas of Saudi Arabia have been an attempt to purge Islam of all pagan things that would be considered synchronistic, that it maybe have over thousands of years become incorporated into Islam. Protestant Christianity said, hey, we want to reject many aspects of Roman Catholicism that they felt brought in too much pagan elements into Christianity. But the idea of these polytheistic societies, and one like we see with Rome, is to integrate several religious traditions without really seeing them as a contradiction. Okay, even in China, they do that. You'll see somebody get married at a Taoist temple and have a funeral, a Confucian funeral, and maybe even get married at a Christian wedding or do something like that. In the Far East, it's also very common to fuse, synchronize different, and synthesize all these different ones. And then we had the idea of the unconquered sun. I mean, if you notice when you did that reading, you can see also the eerie resemblance of certain Christian practices. One, December 25th being significant. I'm sure you guys all noticed that right away, where you have Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and it becoming a part of the Roman religion that the 25th of December is the birth and resurrection day of Mithras. It's also incorporated into this. Yes, I mean, even if you look in the biblical tradition, Jesus would have most likely been born in the spring, not in the winter. December 25th comes from this Roman pagan influence that it does. Okay, so I'm going to end it here. We'll talk about Roman religion a little bit more. Looking at here, we see where Egyptian elements are even mixed with Roman. I'm going to talk a lot about Judaism next.